My name is John Sylvester. I'm Australia's longest serving crime reporter and write a weekly column for The Age. Many of my colleagues have wondered why I've never bothered to move to other areas of the paper. The reason's pretty simple. I've got the best job in journalism, playing cops and robbers and getting paid for it. Over more than 40 years I've covered some of Australia's biggest crimes and met fascinating characters on both sides of the law. In this series you'll hear from them, the cops and the crooks, telling their stories. Welcome to my world. Welcome to Naked City. It took 2 days on a train for the 16-year-old Keith Banks to travel 1,300 kilometres from Townsville to Brisbane's Police Academy in Oxley. By the time he was 21, the non-drinking country kid was a dope-smoking, binge-drinking undercover officer, regularly risking his life to infiltrate drug syndicates, all the time knowing his targets could be tipped off by corrupt cops. We're going to have a chat with Keith Banks, a former undercover policeman from Queensland. Keith's written a book called Drugs, Guns and Lies, and it's the best crime book I've seen published in Australia in 10 years. And I probably know a bit about it because I've written some pretty bad ones. And this is the book that you can't put down because it tells the secrets. It's not the embossed glossy, it just smells of reality. Keith, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Lyle. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we go back into Queensland. You're a young fella in your teens, green as grass, and you decide to join the job. Why?
Mate, I grew up in a pretty challenging childhood, and I make no secret of that. My mother divorced my natural father when I was a baby. She remarried a man when I was about six and a half, who pretty quickly showed his true colours as a heavy drinking, probably verging on alcoholic, certainly abusive personality. He progressed into wife beating. He beat me pretty much every day. We moved through a number of schools. I've lost count of how many schools I went to in primary school. So a new kid on the block, belted every new school I went to, etc. As a result of all of that, we moved around, as I said, and I decided pretty quickly in my childhood not to be like my surroundings. And my mother, bless her, taught me to stand up for the underdog. So I guess all of those things really built up a motivation to do something that actually protected people from bullies and predators.
So you take the train from Townsville at the age of 16. So that would have been the cadets. You would have been a grub. Yeah,
yeah, I was a grub, yeah. I can't remember what term they called it in Queensland, but yeah, cadet system where I did year 12 in the academy.
What sort of era are we talking about?
1975 I started at the academy, so I did year 12. 76 did my second 12 months. Then I had to wait till I turned 19 to be sworn. So that was May 1977.
So you join the police force in Queensland where Joe Peterson is the Premier and Terry Lewis was the Commissioner. We now know that Terry was rotten as a chop.
Yeah, absolutely. When I first joined Whitrod, Ray Whitrod was the Commissioner.
Great man. He was a great Commissioner.
Their owners in recent months, every section of the news media today requested an urgent conference with the Police Commissioner, Mr. Whitrod.
Mr. Whitrod, is it true that 2 months ago the police were told by several sources that a protection racket among Brisbane restaurants and nightclubs was being organised by the underworld and a well-known criminal from down south was coming to Brisbane to set up this and organise crime in general?
We've endeavoured to keep a contact with this particular informant in the hope that he could give us more specific information about it, and we've also been increasing our patrols in the area of the nightclubs.
Very, very reformist, and as history shows, the police union then absolutely fought him tooth and nail. As a friend of mine, Mark Wiley, said, anytime you have a new idea, you should put it on the title page, be careful, this contains new concepts. But he was ousted, and I was still naive about that, John. I saw it in the papers. I had no idea really what was going on, just that the commissioner had gone and a new commissioner was installed.
Queensland Commissioner Ray Whitrod was an honest cop who thought Inspector Terry Lewis was a crook, which is why he transferred him as far away from Brisbane as possible. When Premier Joe Peterson appointed Lewis Assistant Commissioner, Whitrod resigned in protest, and Lewis got the top job in 1976. It was the equivalent of pointing the fox in charge of the hen house. When Teflon Terry received a smaller than expected bribe payment, he said cheerfully, "Hey, little fish are sweet."
Commissioner Fitzgerald concludes that promotions and transfers within the police force in the last decade have been less than entirely objective. The practical effect of the system, he says, was to allow personal or political considerations to intrude. Lewis began his own quest for promotion in 1975 when he and his friend, former Assistant Commissioner Tony Murphy, were posted to Western Queensland by the then Commissioner Ray Whitrod. The report says they successfully cultivated former Premier Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen, Fitzgerald referring to Lewis as an intuitive politician who used opportunities to advance his own cause. The report observes that on appointing Lewis Commissioner in 1976, Bjelke-Petersen supported him to defeat some of those who'd been involved in Whitrod's attempt to combat corruption.
So you go to uniform, obviously, and then move into the mobiles where it's a bit
Yeah, there was,
challenging.
again, this was one of Ray Whitrod's initiatives. Mobile patrols was something that was never imitated anywhere or never introduced anywhere else in Australia. You worked with a permanent partner, you had a permanent patrol sector. We operated out of Petrie Terrace in Brisbane, based really on the Los Angeles Police Department model of patrolling that they still utilise. So you'd find yourself working set shifts with the same partners all around you. Our role was to literally aggressively patrol, pull over suspicious vehicles, do whatever, respond to urgent jobs. I think the KPIs for response in Brisbane at that stage, one of the very few KPIs the police force utilised, was you could have a mobile patrol unit to your house within 3 minutes.
Wow, compare that to
today,
now where
yeah.
it's, you can get a pizza delivered quicker than you can get a copper. Now,
That's right.
You're young, idealistic, and you get recruited to become an undercover officer. How old were you?
I started undercover when I was 21.
So you wouldn't really have not much of a police background by this stage.
About 3 years on
Yep.
the road. Oh, well, actually 2.5. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So what was the sophisticated, extensive undercover training that you went through?
Well, I remember I walked into the office. My main quandary was I didn't know what to wear. So I walked into the office. I was paired up with an older guy, Pete, who was probably 2 or 3 years older than I was. So he might have been 24. He took me upstairs to the firearms area where all of the confiscated firearms that the police had picked up from crooks were stored. I picked up a 25 calibre Browning automatic, a tiny little pistol. He took me downstairs and we rummaged through a box full of false number plates, some off stolen cars, some that just happened to be there. So I picked up a couple of sets of plates for my own car. We used our own personal cars then. And showed me how the Imprest account worked, and that was to sign out buy money. And then we went out. That was it.
Fantastic. So you're out, you're a trained police officer, you've got a little Browning and a bit of cash. So we're talking about a buy-bust type situation, or? A buy-bust is exactly what it sounds like. The undercover buys the drugs with notes where the serial numbers are recorded. Then the dealer is arrested with the marked money. Bingo.
My very first buy, Pete sent me to I remember it well, the Pineapple Bar of the Inala Hotel. And I walked in to meet the informant.
Where else but Queensland would there be a Pineapple Bar? But go on.
That's right. Well, this is a watershed moment in my life, John, because, as I said, I didn't drink. I walked in to meet the informer. He was a big bloke. He was about, he would have been 6'5", but just a big, bikey-looking, imposing, scary man. And I walked over and introduced myself, and he said, "Yeah, I know who you are." And I said, "Oh, how?" So you stand up like dog's balls. Okay, fair enough. And he turned to the barman and said, "2 beers, mate." And I said, "Oh, I don't drink, mate, I'll have orange juice." And he looked at me and he looked me up and down and said, "Well, you effing do now. 2 beers." And that was the watershed, as I said, moment of my life.
And you had a couple of beers and were totally pissed.
I was pissed, yeah. And there I was, I think, day 2 of my undercover life, driving pissed with an informant with a bag of pot in my car that I'd bought off some bloke at the pub.
Welcome to the world of undercovers.
That's right.
So this is where the book takes a twist, because we knew it happened. But in those days they were saying, well, if you're going to infiltrate, you've got to be part of the drug culture.
That's right.
So they virtually gave you the green light to certainly smoke as much dope as you wanted.
Yeah, it was an interesting situation because it was never formally condoned, but certainly informally condoned. It wasn't an issue to walk into the drug squad office, talk to a detective and say, look, I've got no gear. He'd open his locker, take as much as you want. There's the exhibit room, take as much as you want. I never took that step of going to the exhibit room, but I certainly, if I was running short, there are a couple of detectives, more than a couple, that you just simply walk up to and say, mate, I need some gear.
So there was a group of you. How many young undercovers were your mates?
At any one time, there were probably only 5 of us for the entire state, and we did some work over the border as well. Even though I suppose the drug dealers, you'd be working on someone, scoring from them. They'd warn you that there were narcs around. They thought there were hundreds of us. And so you worked your way up to a buy-bust. And a buy-bust is, you'd work your way to a substantial amount of dope or heroin or whatever and have a substantial amount of cash. That's when the police surveillance people would become involved. You'd make the deal in generally a car park or a house, and suddenly there'd be coppers everywhere. You'd be thrown to the ground, handcuffed, dragged away. The problem was that at the end of every buy-bust operation, your identity was disclosed, and not a fake identity, your real name was disclosed to the people that you'd been buying from. So that made it pretty challenging to not be recognised after a period of time. So the average tenure of a narc was probably 2 years maximum.
And the crooks were really filthy on undercovers because you befriended them.
Yeah.
So they saw it as almost not fair.
That's exactly right. You were my mate. You know, what the hell did you do this to me for? And a lot of undercovers I've spoken to over the years, and me included, the challenge for us to cope with this was the fact that we actually went into an operation to befriend people and then betray them. And that messes with your mind. You know, there were some pretty decent blokes that I met that I actually got on well with.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand that. They see this as very black and white, this is a criminal, so they're evil, but they can be fun and generous and loyal.
Yeah.
They just sell drugs.
They just happen to sell drugs, yeah.
Well, one of those good blokes, one of those people that you quite like, you didn't know at the time, but he was actually a double killer.
Yeah, he was an escaped double murderer. This was after I'd finished undercover full-time, I suppose, and I'd gone back into uniform, then back into the CIB, ended up in the drug squad, and Larry was one of my best friends. He was still undercover, and he was on his way to a job in Cairns. So I could see that he was probably in there way too long. He was pretty nervous about the whole world again, and understandably. So I convinced one of the senior cops in the drug squad I needed to be up there as his controller. But we got to Cairns, we moved in together, and I just slipped straight back into the undercover world. So during the operation, we met a guy, and we bought from him, and he was a pretty affable bloke. Told us he could, I think it was about £100 of gear that we were setting up to buy from him.
How much would that have been worth?
God, in those days, and it was Cairns or North Queensland dope, so it was prime. You could, I think it was about two grand a pound. You could easily sell, and remember this is back in the 80s, you could probably move that quantity of dope for about 5 in Brisbane and maybe 6 or 7 in Sydney. So the turnaround profit margin was huge.
You would have had a fair bit of buy money.
We would have been able to get it, yeah. I didn't. We had cash, sufficient cash, and again in those days, mate, you could set up a false bank account with. Don't think there was any need for a 100-point identification.
No, there wasn't. No.
So from memory, I had 2 or 3 different accounts, and we'd use those to get cash out. But any buy, you'd simply ring the office from a public phone booth and say, look, we're still alive, number 1, and number 2, we're setting this up and we need a team up here and we need, a couple $100,000 in cash. So what this bloke was, we found out later, intending to do was actually knock me for the cash, and I was intending to have him pinched for the £100, which I thought was a bit harsh, really.
Well, luckily you got in first.
That's right. And I thought he liked me.
Now, your people, you included, were using dope recreationally as well as in the job. Now, tell us about the little bet you would have with your mates regarding the police club.
Yeah, I suppose to give that some context, as I said, I was a clean skin when I started this. And we were smoking dope on jobs, absolutely. And what we rapidly realised, or what I rapidly realised and the other guys shared, was that we were ostracised from the normal police environment. A lot of cops didn't trust, or not they didn't trust it, they didn't like us because we were living a life they weren't. They'd throw us into situations with very little intelligence background, often none.
What was the expression they referred to?
One of them called us meat on the hoof, which is a country term about cattle waiting to be slaughtered, and the only way that the only reason cattle are treated well is that you know you're going to slaughter them, and there's a benefit in it. So that's what that was the attitude towards us. Look, we started smoking weed recreationally. I think that simply evolved because if you're sitting in a house or wherever with patched outlaw motorcycle gang members or drug dealers or crooks, and you're smoking dope with them, that's challenging, and smoking dope with your mates is the same as having a few beers. Yeah. And so we found that was a stress release for us as well. But then we got a bit pissed off with the way that we were being looked down upon, I suppose. So might have been my idea, might not have been. The police club in Brisbane on a Friday night was packed with coppers, and even though we shouldn't have gone there, we had this need to be back in the family and sort of sit somewhere and just let your hair down and not have to watch your back. So we'd go to the police club. So we decided one day that we'd have a spliff downstairs, put in the eye drops, get nicely stoned, put $20 in each, and whoever went to the police club and sought out the most high-ranking copper took the pot.
So to speak, literally.
That's right.
But it wasn't all beer, Skittles and pot. Tell us about your mate Harry, another undercover.
Harry's journey was the reason I wanted to tell this story. Harry had joined a little after I did, or volunteered for undercover a little after I did. When he started, he was a practising Muslim, non-drinker, certainly non-drug user, and joined for those same idealistic reasons we all did, change the world. Within 12 months he was using heroin. He had a habit. He'd been sent to Cairns on a job, and I've never spoken to him about the detail of it. I've certainly spoken to him about what happened afterwards, but he started using up there he was just in a situation where he had no choice. That when he was in Cairns, he was given a hot shot, and a hot shot is being held down and loaded up with a pure amount of heroin than your body's used to, with the intention of killing him. His local contact, who ironically was a guy I was sworn in with, just had a sense, and so Ray knew something wasn't right, and he got a couple of uniforms together, literally dragged them out of the office on a 4 to midnight shift, and they went and found Harry and kicked down a door, and he was lying there with a spike in his arm, almost dead. So he came back to Brisbane. He wasn't the same bloke, and it turned out he was using. We didn't know he was using. He kept that well hidden, but he certainly was a functioning heroin addict. Kept using, and it turns out that a couple of detectives who I've also spoken about, who were absolutely corrupt bastards, were supplying him with heroin because it suited their purposes to have an undercover guy who was a user, because you could get him into areas that we wouldn't go into. He was then transferred back to court orderly duty, which is pretty insulting for a bloke who had 5 or 6 years service, particularly undercover. He was boarded out medically unfit, no rehab, no apologies, just paid him out, got rid of him, and he put all that money up his arm pretty quickly. Then he started doing armed robberies to feed his addiction in Brisbane, went to Adelaide, did stick-ups there as well, and he was arrested. He ended up doing 3 years in Yatala prison there, brought back to Queensland, did another 7 in Sir David Longlands in Brisbane, where he almost died of a heroin overdose inside as well. But I tracked him down over a sad circumstance about 4 years ago, where Larry passed away of blood cancer.
Larry was Keith's best friend in the force, who sadly died too young from cancer. Keith invited Harry, who was struggling with a heroin addiction, to the funeral to rekindle their long-lost friendship.
Found him, rang him. He cried. We cried, because I hadn't spoken to Harry for years. Good God, 25, easily, lost count. And I persuaded him to come to the funeral. I gave the eulogy for Larry, and Larry's fervent wish was that we didn't turn up in dark suits. We all turned up in Hawaiian shirts, the loudest, most horrible shirts you could find. I got the gang back together, essentially, got the band back together, and Harry was one of them. And he has been, or was embraced straight back into the group. No judgment. He's turned his life around. He's happily married with a family, and is just back to who he was before all this shit happened to him.
The bastards who fed him the heroin, they were you had a dealing with them in the police club?
Yeah. Larry and I were sitting in the police club, and I think it was after the job in Cairns, actually. And we're sitting there having a couple of beers and, having a laugh, and these two and one other literally walked up to the table, bit of a semicircle around us, and in no uncertain terms said, look, you blokes are staunch meaning loyal, don't give people up, absolutely, unless it's for corruption. But yeah, you blokes are staunch, so want to make you a deal. We've got a fair bit of powder, I assume it was heroin, that we need to move, and next time you blokes are out on a job, we'll give it to you, you move it, and we split the profits.
Staggering.
Yeah.
Staggering how open it is that you think that you can get away with that sort of offer. But you went into the drug squad and you saw people bagging up dope to resell.
Yeah. One night, Larry and I dropped in there. We'd try and get in there under cover of darkness, either to drop off paperwork or pick stuff up. And we literally walked in, and this is the ground floor of CIB headquarters. Now, there was a detective senior sergeant in the reception. The drug squad was on the ground floor. No access control. So pretty open door policy, I guess. And we walked in, there's a couple of guys there with what appeared to be probably 3 or 4 pounds, and they're bagging it up in little baggies and putting it in a suitcase. And Larry and I stopped, and we looked at them, they looked at us, nodded their heads, and just went straight back to work.
Yeah, that's how open it was. Of course, Terry Lewis ended up being the Fitzgerald Royal Commission.
As Commissioner Tony Fitzgerald was handing his report to the Premier, at the exhibition ground, armed guards patrolled outside. At 9:04, the most comprehensive review of the administration in Queensland and what was wrong with it was handed out. It was heads down, pouring through the text of the maroon-covered telephone directory-sized Fitzgerald report. The contents are a searing indictment of how this state has been governed. As expected, Commissioner Tony Fitzgerald is recommending no charges be laid against individuals. That's for Special Prosecutor Doug Drummond QC to determine. The Queensland Police Force is in for a massive shake-up. A Criminal Justice Commission is recommended. It will overview and assess the police.
Terry Lewis he was Sir Terry Lewis, and he ended up going to jail.
About 40 of the Fitzgerald inquiry's hardier groupies began lining up outside Court 29 from 4 a.m. It's the day they, and indeed most Queenslanders, have been waiting for. Since then, several police have admitted corruption and resigned or been sacked. Former Police Commissioner Sir Terence Lewis has been stood aside. Former bagman Jack
Miller, who was the Victoria Chief Commissioner and the best commissioner the country's ever seen, he was behind the Australian Bureau of Criminal Intelligence, which was supposed to be this collegiate group of all the police forces working together on criminal intelligence. It was Mick's idea, it was his brainchild, and yet they always had a commissioner as the chairman overlooking it, and the others voted Terry Lewis in to be the chair, not once but twice. They never let Mick become the chairman because, you know what, he would have made it work, and they didn't want it. They didn't want people looking into their backyard.
And I've often been asked the question, well, how did you cope with the corruption? So, well, first of all, it wasn't everywhere, often very senior police. But it's like water finding its own level. You know, those of us who were straight and honest coppers, would gravitate to those who were straight and honest coppers. So this particular job, Larry and I were introduced to a Sicilian chap. Met this guy in the car park of the Centennial Hotel, the Centennial Swimming Pool in Brisbane. Thankfully, this time had the car wired by the BCI. And this particular fellow who was Sicilian, very, very strong Sicilian accent, he was I was 23, 24. He would have been in his late 40s, quite strongly built, and certainly a bad man. I said to Larry that afternoon, for some reason, look, I'm not going to take my gun with me. I had a habit of carrying my 25 in my boot, and I just had a sense of something. I said, I won't take it with me today, because my cover was, I was some spoilt kid who'd inherited, again, the magic $100,000 from an auntie in Sydney. I wanted to turn it around. Larry got a hold of a 9mm Luger and put it in the glove box of the car. And so we said, okay, this is the story. We'll meet him. I'll get in the back. We'll have a chat. Car's wired. We'll set up the next meet. We'll talk about the deal. The first thing this guy did was he jumped in the back seat, moved straight over to me, and went for my boots. And I said, "What the hell are you doing?" He said, in that very strong Sicilian accent, "I think you're a narc. If you're a narc, narcs carry guns in their boots." I said, "Well, I'm not a fucking narc. I'm just, I'm here to make some money." Yeah. And then he looked at me, and again, I've only ever seen eyes like that twice. The other guy was the escaped double murderer, and this man. You'll read cliched conversations about looking into blackness. This actually happens. And I looked into these eyes that were completely black and soulless. And he said, well, it doesn't matter if you are a narc. If you fuck me, I'll kill you, your friends, and your family. And he pointed his forefinger and thumb at me, and I can still hear him saying, it's a banga, 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 you're all dead. He said, but if you are a narc and you want to work with me, that's okay, because I know police, we do business all the time. And he said, and I'll find out if you are. And I'm sitting there thinking, geez, this isn't going well so far. And what he did was he then named 3 senior police, but he named 3 senior police that were not public figures. And that's when I realised that he was probably fair income. Finished the deal, arranged to give him a call through the intermediary, etc. That was in the early evening from memory. So went back to headquarters, the BCI guys gave us the tape, and in fact one of them said something like, you probably want to hold on to this. And again, it was a bit of a nod that we know what's going on, mate, just for your own safety, here's your copy. And you didn't really get a copy much. Larry and I went and found a pub, and he used to tell the story. He said, that's when Banksy really discovered what Scotch was. I think I had a couple of double Scotches straight up, because it was pretty scary stuff. Went back into the office a couple of days later, and our boss then, he's passed away now. Terry Channels was one of the best. He, out of all of them, he actually understood what we did. Anyway, so I went back in with Terry and sat with Larry, and he said, all right, boys, looked at us and just said, the tape's gone upstairs. And upstairs meaning Lewis. He said, it's gone upstairs. I understand if you want to push on with this, but if you do, I have to tell you I can't guarantee your safety, because the job involved going over the border in New South Wales. And we looked at each other, and in that unspoken moment, I just turned back to the boss and said, understand, boss, look, we might just leave it as it is.
Probably a good choice.
Good choice.
I said to you the other day that about all the trauma, and you said actually it was pretty good being undercover. I mean, just explain the lifestyle.
Yeah, well, we were kids that had no supervision. From my perspective, I'd gone through the academy. I'd come from a very, as I said, challenging childhood, then into the academy that was very paramilitary. That was back in the days where, punishment, you'd clean tiles with a toothbrush and march around the oval with a 303 Lee Enfield above your head for a couple of hours. It's stuff that never happened now. Into uniform, where you're told when to take your meal break, when to turn up. Into a world where there's none of that. Grow your hair, put an earring in, do what the hell you want. And as I said to you the other day, get on the gas, smoke weed, access to guns and a shitload of cash. And as young blokes, what was not to enjoy?
Exactly. So what was it like then trying to come back to the regimentation of policing?
Well, I bought, I'm pretty sure it was a half an ounce of heroin one afternoon, and then the next morning I was at the hairdresser's getting all my hair cut off to go back into uniform back to mobiles that morning. We call it resurfacing. So when you're deep undercover, you resurface back into the world. There was no rehabilitation is the wrong word, but no counselling, no how you doing. Let's give you a few weeks off just to get back into the sense of it. Oh no, I was back in a patrol car on the road thinking, shit, that was trippy. I'd changed. I was a different person. I was probably jaded beyond my years. I was certainly tougher. But I had a grey view of the world, not a black and white one. It actually taught me not to judge quickly and completely on appearance or background.
You can go one of two ways. In my experience, you find people who just become black and white, and those who actually see the sepia. And it's the second ones who survive to realise that there are crooks who can love their kids. But you were saying at one point that you were smoking more dope than the dealers you were dealing with.
Yeah, we were. Yeah, Spider lives overseas. He's been off the radar.
He's one of your undercover.
He was
friends.
an undercover. Yeah. He's the poor guy. He's got chronic PTSD. He was telling me when he first started in undercover, he was given a bag of dope by a detective. He said he brought it home and he put it on his bedside table and it stayed there for a month. He didn't know whether it was a test, whether he was supposed to use it, whether he was not supposed to use it, and that pretty much started off his undercover career with an anxiety level and not really knowing what the hell was going on. Yeah, he was smoking more pot than the rest of us by the time it all finished. And I think in hindsight that was self-medicating. We didn't admit to each other that we were worried or anxious or scared because we were 10 foot tall and bulletproof. But I think that was a case of it was easy access, more enjoyable than getting pissed. I've never seen anybody who's beaten their wife when they've had a couple of spliffs. But it just became a lifestyle for us.
If you like this podcast, subscribe and rate it. Very highly, obviously. Tell your friends. They'll love you for it. Keith wasn't addicted to drugs. He did take speed once, but he spun out so badly he stopped taking any powders. But he was actually addicted to adrenaline. When he came back to orthodox policing, after living on his nerves as an undercover, it just wasn't enough, so he joined the Tactical Response Group. So you've got through this relatively
unscathed, yeah.
But you go to the Tactical Response Group, which is equivalent to our Special Operations Group.
Yeah, I volunteered for tactical work.
Was that because you were missing the adrenaline?
Yeah, I needed adrenaline, and I was absolutely addicted to it. Normal policing wasn't doing it for me anymore. You know, that's the person I was then. So we were tasked with executing a search warrant in a suburb called Virginia, and we were information was 100% that Paul James Mullen, who was number one most wanted in Queensland, and I think number two nationally, violent, vicious armed robber.
In 1987, Keith was part of a raiding party sent to arrest Paul Mullen, a violent armed robber who'd been on the run for 9 years.
Paul James Mullen had a record of violent crime stretching back to the mid-1970s. He appeared regularly on most wanted lists after escaping from Sydney's Long Bay jail in 1978. An ex-soldier, extremely fit, and an expert bushman and marksman, Mullen came north and lived in remote campsites within striking distance of coastal towns. A confidential memo circulated to every police force in the country warned of Mullen's record.
All of our police in Australia have been warned that he's armed at all times. He has used firearms before.
We worked with the intelligence and surveillance guys for a couple of days. We looked at various plans, whether to take him out in public, take him out meaning intercept, whether to do a vehicle intercept or other tactics, and we decided the risk was far too great because he was, given his background, he'd open up on us in public, which meant members of the public are at risk. So the only viable option we had was to knock down the door. I put the operation plan together with one of my colleagues, and we wanted to use tear gas and distraction grenades. That went to Force Command, and a particular assistant commissioner decided it was too aggressive. So he refused permission for us to use gas and distraction grenades. So we were forced to literally knock the door down. So
knowing certainly that he was armed.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, knowing that he was armed.
Mullen's favourite weapons were sawn-off .22 rifles and shotguns, but the last gun he used was a Ruger 223 semi-automatic hunting rifle, a commercial version of the military M14.
Well, they fire mostly a 55-grain projectile at over 3,000 feet a second.
Which is pretty fast?
Which is quite fast and quite effective.
We went there, hit the door. He had changed the hinges around on the door so it opened outwards, not inwards, which slowed our entry by probably 3 to 5 seconds, which is a long time in a tactical raid. So the team my instruction was that if they heard the door smashing, as soon as they heard that, they were to throw a ladder up through the bedroom window to indicate they'd be coming in that way to distract his attention. As soon as that happened, he was up out of bed and fired 2 rounds through the skirting board, exactly where a team would be on the ladder, so he was ready to go. We got in. In essence, Peter Kidd was number one.
Senior Constable Peter Kidd.
Senior Constable Peter Kidd, yeah.
Good mate of yours?
Great mate of mine, yeah. He was another full-timer. Steve Grant, who was a guy I was living with, who was a very, very good friend, was in the team. So as we went in, Peter pushed the door of the bedroom open, Mullen fired through the door, kept firing at Peter as he went inside. Gunfight. The gunfight took literally seconds. We dispatched Mullen to the netherworld, and Peter was hit 5 times. He died that morning in hospital.
Senior Constable Peter Kidd had been a policeman 10 years, serving since 1985 in the Task Force and the Tactical Response Group. Police Commissioner Lewis today described Senior Constable Kidd as a reliable, friendly officer who was respected by all his colleagues. He'll receive a funeral with full police honours, possibly later this week.
What really messed me up, I remember very vividly, when the firing had stopped, I went straight over to where Peter was in the corner. He was a crumpled mess in the corner, and pulled open his black jumpsuit and saw all the wounds, and nothing I could do. Just held on to him and tried to comfort him while he was dying, and it's something you never forget. It was horrible.
You would have had vests, but he had quite a powerful.
Yeah, he had a 223. Yeah, so 5.56 in military parlance. The vests we had then were level 3 vests. They were only ever designed to resist shotgun or pistol. Even a .22 rifle, high velocity, would have gone through them.
Police say no bulletproof vest currently available could have stopped Mullen's bullets.
We have what we regard as the best in this type of equipment.
I had the classic flashbacks, nightmares, insomnia, anger, depression, anxiety, back to anger. A couple of months later, after Peter died, I was sitting at home. I demolished the best part of a bottle of scotch, and I was playing a song called The Green Fields of France by the Fureys, over and over and over again.
Do you mind if I sit here down by your graveside and rest for a while?
And I found myself, I had my firearm, I had my 9mm, because we'd been told there were contracts on our heads through associates of Mullen, so we're given permission to carry off duty. But I remember sitting there looking at it, and then I found that I'd put it in my mouth. I'd racked up a round in it. It was on single action. And I remember sitting there thinking, if I just squeeze the trigger, it's probably 1 pound of pressure. I'll know what Peter knows, which is just an incredibly, crazy is not the right word, but divorced from reality, thought, yeah? And the only reason I didn't do it is not because of fear of death, because when you're in that state, in that depressive, traumatised state, it doesn't really gel with you. I didn't want my girlfriend coming home and finding brain matter on the wall. And I flashed back to a suicide I'd been to where a guy took his head off with a 303. And I remember thinking, oh, gee, that wouldn't be good for her. And then with that thought, then clarity immediately came rushing back. And I pulled the bloody thing out of my mouth and thought, what the fuck am I doing? Unloaded it, ejected the round, stripped it down to its slide and stock and mag, and hid the 3 component parts around the house. Bear in mind I was pretty pissed. And woke up the next morning and I thought, shit, this is not good. You know, I don't know what's happening to me. And unfortunately in those days, no one knew what PTSD was. There was no counselling available, there was no... And it was just a matter of me working through it as best I could. Because again, in the macho culture, we didn't tell each other.
Most people would not want to put themselves back in that situation, but you responded exactly the opposite.
Yeah. I wanted to get back there, and I wanted to get back in the field, and I wanted to be in a situation where I could actually take someone out again.
So you wanted to kill someone?
I wanted to knock someone, yeah. I don't know whether it was a feeling of revenge or whether I wanted to prove to myself that it's like getting back on a horse, or whether I just became homicidal. So I was in another job about a year later. Another guy was shot at a siege, and that was just getting good to me. And I do remember being on a stairwell outside this unit where this guy had taken his mother hostage, and we ended up pumping a lot of gas in there and went in, and he produced a weapon and he was shot in the chest with a shotgun. He was firing at police cars, and I turned to my mate and said, I'm going to kill this prick. And I had no compunction or compassion. All of that had gone. And I was involved in some more situations. Shots were fired, and I took a guy out. Leslie Connolly was a New South Wales armed robber who had been doing stick-ups around the Redcliffe area. He'd been stopped by 3 police and they pulled him over. He walked back to the car and got the drop on them and stole all their firearms, threatened to kill them and bolted. So we were called in. But we found him about 2 months later, and Connolly was meeting a particular gun dealer in Redcliffe to buy a fully automatic SKS. Cut a long story short, we had the surveillance team involved and we took him out. I was hoping he would produce one of the firearms or have it in his hand or give me any opportunity. I would have drilled him. I'd calculated it all. From a purely tactical perspective, I was absolutely looking forward to taking him out. Once I realised that was the case, I knew it was time to leave.
But there's the extreme irony, is that you've gone through a period of time where you're actually seeking a fatal confrontation.
Yep.
And then you go back into the crime department and you end up in a situation where you would have been amply justified to do exactly that. And that's the siege. Where was it, the MLC building?
The MLC building, yeah.
What happened there?
I was, in the crime department, and I was with my mate, and we were in an undercover car, and an any units shots fired any unit call. Male person, shots fired, MLC building in the centre of the city, and we were pretty close, so responded immediately. Raced in there, and I got there, and I remember I had my firearm in my hand, and I raced up the steps, and I went there, absolutely shoot him if I had to. This guy was sitting on the floor. He had a lever-action rifle across his lap, cardboard box with a 12-volt battery and army webbing. I just started talking to him and said, all I saw was the rifle. I didn't see what was in the box at that stage. And he said, why don't you come in and have a talk to me? And I have no idea why, mate. I still don't know why I did. Took a couple of steps inside and started talking to him. And when I got in there, I said, so what's in the box? And I remember he pulled in, reached into the box and pulled out something and tossed it at me, and I caught it. It was a half a stick of sweating gelignite.
No, just very handy.
Yeah, I thought, oh, this is great. I took a couple of steps closer and I looked in the box. It was an IED. It turned out to be 16 sticks of gelignite and 3 electronic dets, wired in series and ready to go. So I spent an hour and a half talking with Frank and persuading him to give it all up. And the other rule I broke was he wanted a 6-pack, so I went outside and persuaded the boss to give him get him a pot of light beer. And he was also smoking Craven A's over a box of sweating gelignite, which is not the best thing to do. So he said, and I stopped smoking, and as I used to smoke, and he said,
and then you could have started again.
Well, actually, funny you should say that, because he said, you want a cigarette? And I said, yeah, why not? We spent. It transpired he was a Vietnam vet. He had major PTSD, and I got that. Towards the end, as I thought, geez, I've got him now, he reached in the webbing pack and pulled a hand grenade out and pulled the pin and said, that's it, mate, I'm going to kill us. So with a hand grenade, you've generally got maybe 3 to 5 seconds when the lever is released for it to detonate. And I thought, even if I get up and run away, I'm stuffed. You know, with 16 sticks of jelly, there's going to be bits and pieces of me raining all over South Bank across the river. So I just looked at him and said, mate, I've got enough nightmares as it is. I don't want you to be another one. Can you just please put the pin back? 30 seconds is a long time. Took him 30 seconds to agree to put the pin back in and give me the grenade, and then he eventually agreed to come out with me, which was a pretty eventful Saturday afternoon.
He won 2 Valour Awards, one for the fatal Mullins raid and the second for the MLC siege. But it came at a cost. He was suffering from chronic post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, I wasn't in a good way. Emotionally, I was a mess. I was doing an undergrad degree in justice studies, and I remember doing some reading on American police shootings, and I read about this thing called PTSD and their symptoms, and I looked at the symptoms and went, shit, that's me.
Tick the box, tick the box.
Tick, yeah.
Big issue, but it's being dealt with in Victoria because you get your you get your plaque, and off you go after the farewell, and you're on your own. You've lost the network.
Yep.
And certainly in Victoria, and I know around the country, they're trying to bring in ex-members, and for any ex-member listening who feels that that's where they are, contact your police associations. You will not be turned away now. It is accepted, it is legitimate, and there will be people who listen to this, there are ex-members who go, exactly what we were saying, tick the box, tick the box, tick the box. You are not alone.
The thing about anybody listening to this, if they have the same feelings, symptoms, sadness, anxiety, you're not alone. It is just a consequence of the job.
Keith, thanks for sharing your story. The book is Drugs, Guns and Lies. If you've listened to this podcast, obviously you're interested in true crime, do yourself a favour, go and get the book. It's a cracking read. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, John.
If this podcast has set off any alarm bells, contact Lifeline or similar organisations. Reach out. You're not alone. Naked City is brought to you by The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Subscriptions power our newsroom, so to support independent journalism, consider subscribing to the Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode was produced and edited by Anu the Axe Hasbold. It was mixed by Cool Hand Cormac Lally. Archives by 9 and 3AW. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. I'm John Sylvester. Thanks for listening.